In games, you often have some kind of dialogue in order to get an idea of the story as you progress through a game. And this can come in a couple different forms. One of my personal favorites is text. And the reason I personally prefer text dialogue is for one simple reason. Text is easy to modify, whereas if you have audio, you have to record and potentially even re-record audio every time that you want to make changes or add on additions to your game. Text is something you can set up once very simply and reuse periodically throughout your game. So in this video, I'm going to show you how you can set up text-based dialogue in your VR game. But before we jump into that, if you're new to this video and want to see more just like this one, be sure to like and subscribe button down below. With that, let's jump right into the video. All right, so let me go and give you a quick look at how this is all going to look when everything is done. So I added in a plane over here off to my right. So if I go and teleport in, we start getting some dialogue that starts running across the screen. Now this is just random dialogue. I put in just 3 random strings of dialogue. It's just going to choose one at random, and then it creates a little blinking square down there in the bottom right when it's done. Just kind of signifying that that text is all done. And if I hit either of my triggers, it'll scroll through a little quicker, as well as go on to another random string of dialogue. Now this doesn't have to be randomized. I randomized this just for an example, but if you have dialogue that you want to run in a specific order, then that's certainly an option as well. You're just going to have to, go through one at a time. Instead of just randomly choosing ones like I'm doing here. Now this is great just for being able to detect when a player is nearby to some dialogue source. If there's an NPC off to the left, for example, then that would make this a great example. You just walk up to the NPC and they just automatically start talking like this. So let me go and jump into the video and I can show you exactly how all of this is done. First things first, let's first create a material. Now this material is going to act as just kind of an indicator that our text is done. So what I like to do is just create a new folder called materials, and in here create a material. Once you have this open, we need to do 2 things. First off, the material domain needs to be changed from surface to user interface because we're going to be using this in the UI itself. The other thing we're going to want to do is change blend mode to translucent. This is going to allow for us to make a blinking effect, which I personally just think looks a little bit nicer for that indicator. Once we have that, the final color needs to be whatever color you want this blinking material to be. In this case, I'm going to shift it to just a solid white, just so we can very clearly see it. After this, we need to go ahead and get time, feed that time node into sign, and then this sign needs to be rounded before being passed into opacity. Once we feed that into opacity, we should see over on the preview that our material starts blinking, which is exactly what we want for this example. So once we have that, we can go ahead and close down the material and return back to the level. Now that we have this material, let's go ahead and create our UI. I'm going to create another new folder. This one's going to be called UI. Then in this folder, I'm going to create a new widget blueprint that's going to act as our user interface. Once in this UI, we need to do a couple things. First off, we need to add in a canvas panel. This is going to allow for us to easily position things around the canvas panel as we need to. The next, we need to add in a text. This text I'm going to go ahead and center, and I'm going to go ahead and make this all look just a little bit nicer, a little bit more centered, so that way it all looks a lot cleaner when we're actually using this. And finally, in our text, I'm also going to go ahead and make sure that this word wraps. If you'd like, you can also go ahead and customize the appearance of the text. I'm not going to do that in this tutorial as we just need a simple text to see. So I'm just going to leave all this alone. And finally, for the canvas panel, I also want to go ahead and add in an image. This image is going to act as that little indicator that's going to allow for us to see when the text is finished displaying. I'm going to go ahead and position this where it needs to go. Then once I have it positioned where I want it and I have the scale just as I would like, I'm going to also click down on the brush, and in the brush we should be able to set the material that we just created, and that should allow for this image to start blinking white and disappearing. Now, one final thing that also needs to happen, we also want to make sure that this text block is set to is variable. If we look up in the top of the details, there's going to be a little checkbox that's just going to say is variable. We want to make sure that this checkbox is checked. That's going to allow for us to access this text box very easily. Once we have this done, next I'm going to go ahead and jump into the event graph itself. Once we're in the event graph, I'm going to first remove all of the events except for the event construct. We'll be using the event construct in order to just hide our text as well as our image once we actually start playing the game. This is just going to allow for us to see what it's actually going to look like before we start. So I usually like to hide on the event construct personally. Next, I'm going to create a custom event. I'm going to call this event set dialog. This is going to allow for us to start printing out a dialog. Then we need a couple of variables that we're going to be setting here on the set dialog. First, I'm going to make a string. This string is going to be set immediately after we call this set dialog, and this is going to be an input value as well on this custom event. Then I'm also going to create a new integer called last string. This is going to keep track of what character on the string we are currently on. So this is going to allow for us to create that whole scrolling effect. Then finally, I also want to make a boolean called dialog complete. This is going to keep track of whether we've reached the end of our dialog or not. If this is true, then we've reached the end. If it's false, then we haven't. Then in the set dialog event, I want to make sure that last string gets set to -1, and I want to make sure that dialog complete gets set to false. Now, this should be false by default, but we want to make sure that this gets set to false each and every time that we start printing out dialog. That's why we're making sure everything gets set right now. Then finally, we also need to make sure that both our image and our text box both have the correct visibility set. For this example, I'm going to make sure that the text box has a set visibility set to visible, and I want to make sure that our image gets set to hidden. This is going to allow for us to make sure everything is set up if we manage to reach the end of our text and just reset everything as we need it to. Now let's start printing out our string. To do this, I'm going to get that dialog string that we set at the beginning of this event. And with this, I want to get a substring. This substring is going to have a start index of 0 every time. This means that we're going to be starting all the way at the beginning of that string. Then the length is going to be equal to our last string integer plus 1. I also want to make sure that this last string plus 1 also gets set into the last string variable, so that way when we come back and move on to the next character, it's going to keep on incrementing each and every time. Then once we have this substring, I'm going to go ahead and get that text box again. I'm going to set text. Now, as you can see, this requires a text, but we're using a string. So if we go ahead and grab the string and move that into a text, then it will automatically convert that string to a text for us. Now, as a quick side note, in case you're curious why we didn't just take a text input instead of use a string like we're currently doing, there's actually two reasons for that. First, Text actually does not allow for us to split the substring like this. Only strings will allow for us to do that. In addition, text also doesn't allow for us to get a length and help us determine how many characters are in that string. We're going to need that in 1 second. String, on the other hand, allows for us to do both. So if we were to take a text input, we certainly could do that, but we would need to keep in mind that that text would need to be converted to a string, and then that string would again need to be converted back to a text, which could certainly be done and wouldn't be that complicated, but it's just a little bit more of a process than if we just took a string and converted that straight to a text. Now once this is done, we need to go ahead and get that last string plus 1, and we need to check to see if it is less than the lane of the dialog string. Now in case you're curious, this lane is short for length, and this is going to allow for us to determine how many characters are all together in that string. This is going to help us determine if we are at or near the end of our string or not. We're going to go and feed this boolean into a branch, and then on true we're going to set timer by event. Now in the set timer by event, the timer number is going to be how long we're going to have in between each character being generated into that string. Now I usually don't like to do anything above 0.1. I feel like if it's above 0.1 it's just going to be a little bit too slow. But if you'd like to go above or below this, you certainly can. Just keep in mind that this is going to determine how fast or how slowly that dialogue comes out. Then using the event, we're going to go ahead and feed that into a custom event. And I'm going to call this custom event continue dialog. We won't be using this aside from the set timer by event anyways. And then this custom event is going to plug into where we set that integer to +1. Then finally, we need to set the boolean dialog complete to true on false. In addition, we'll also need to set the image from hidden to visible. Now once this is all done, we need 2 more custom events that we're going to be using later on. The first one is going to be called advanced dialog. And this custom event is going to be pretty simple. All we're going to do is we're going to take the string, get the length, and that's going to be set to our previous length integer. Now, the reason that this works is at this point we should be running through that set dialog event somewhere in there. So by simply setting this integer to where it needs to be, it should automatically set our string each and every time, and it should automatically follow down that false branch and just kind of continue on as though everything just progressed. Then the second event we need to make is called hide dialog, and this one's pretty simple. We're just going to grab both our image and our text block, and we're going to set both of those visibilities to hidden. The final step is on the event construct. We're also going to go ahead and run that hide dialog event. This is just going to make sure that everything gets hidden right off the bat, so that way we don't need to worry about seeing the text right off the bat if we don't want to. Now once this is all done, we can go and close down this UI and return back to our level. In here, I'm again going to go ahead and open up our content browser. And in here, I'm going to create another new folder called Blueprints. Now this blueprint is going to be of type actor. I'm going to call this dialog widget. This is going to hold that UI that we just made, as well as some other functionality. We'll get into that in 1 second. Then once we're in this actor, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a widget component. And I usually like setting this to the root component, but you don't have to. This is certainly optional. And once we have this in our components, we can go ahead and go off to the right here. We can set the widget class to that same UI we created. And in addition to this, we may need to increase the draw size. This is going to differ depending on how your UI is set up. But I usually like to go in here, set the draw size manually to 1920 by 1080. Then next, I'm also going to go ahead and add in a second box collision component. We don't need to do anything for this. This is just going to be to trigger the dialog starting once we actually enter that box collision. Now we'll come back to the box later on in order to get some of its events, but for now we're going to go and leave that alone, and we're going to start off in our event graph. In the event graph, we need to do a couple things. First, I'm going to create two variables. The first one is going to be a Boolean, and I'm going to call this player viewing. This is just going to help us determine if we are currently or not currently within the bounds of that collision, and allow for us to determine if we need to start or stop our dialogue. And the second one is going to be an array of strings. I'm going to call this dialogue strings, and this is just going to hold a bunch of random strings that we can run through the dialogue UI in order to have them display. Now, as I had mentioned in the preview, you can certainly change this and you can have some other method of accessing those strings. Maybe you want to store them in the player, or maybe you want to store them in some other actor altogether for some reason. You can certainly do that, but for this example, I'm just going to be storing this as an array of strings since this is a pretty simple way of just having strings to use. Once this is done, we'll go and move on to the event begin play. And this isn't too complicated. All I'm going to do is I'm going to grab our widget component. I'm going to get the user widget object, and I'm going to cast this to the UI that we had created. And then I'm going to store this as a variable. This is just going to allow for us to easily access the UI and all of the events that we created in the UI itself. So that way we don't need to cast each and every time, and we just have this stored for later. Once you have this variable created, let's go and create a custom event. We're going to call this custom event continue dialogue, and this is just going to help us determine what point in any dialogue we're currently in. Now, first thing we're going to do is we're going to get that player viewing variable, and we're going to feed that into a branch. Now, on false, we're going to get that widget variable that we had created, and I'm going to call hide dialogue on false. On true, however, we're going to get the dialogue complete variable that we have in the widget UI itself, and I'm going to feed that into another branch on true. Now for this on false, I'm going to run advanced dialogue. This is just going to make sure that we automatically jump to the end of our dialogue. However, on true for this second branch, we're going to set dialogue. And for this, I'm just going to grab a random string from our array, and I'm just going to feed that into that input dialog string. Now once this is all done, last step we need to do is we need to go ahead and now jump into that box collision. And in there, we need to get the on component begin overlap and component end overlap. Now let's start with the on component begin overlap. On component begin overlap, we're going to get the other actor and we're going to check to see if it is our player pawn. Now, if this other actor is equal to our player pawn, we're going to set player viewing to true, and in addition, we're going to run that continue dialogue event we just created. However, on component end overlap, we're going to again check to see if it's equal to our player pawn. However, this time, if it is equal to our player pawn, we're going to set that player viewing variable to false, and then we're going to go and call continue dialogue. This should allow for our dialogue to either start or stop at any point. With that, we can go ahead and close down this actor and we can jump back into level, place it in, and you may need to, of course, rotate around, maybe even modify that box collision if needed. Now, we need to do one more step in order to actually call that advanced dialogue. So I'm going to go ahead and open up our VR pawn. Then in our VR pawn, I'm going to go ahead and just grab the trigger left as well as the trigger right. Now, when either of these are pressed, what we're going to do is we're going to get an actor of class, and we're going to call that actor that we had just created the dialogue widget. And then we're going to run continue dialogue. Now, what this should do is, assuming some dialogue is already being displayed, it should automatically advance our dialogue all the way to the end of whatever dialogue it's currently displaying. And that's it. We should now have dialogue that we're able to display out in front of the player at any point. And in addition to that, we should be able to both advance the dialogue and hide it if for whatever reason we either want to advance or it no longer becomes necessary. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to like and subscribe button down below. And I also want to give a huge shout out to my Patreon supporters. And with that, I'll see you in the next reality.